London, 1942. The city lay shrouded in darkness, its streets barely visible under the strict blackout regulations that had become second nature to its residents. While bombs fell from the sky and families huddled in underground shelters, clutching their children and praying for dawn, one woman sat in the basement of the British Library, surrounded by thousands of index cards, convinced that the answer to breaking Nazi communications lay not in complex mathematics, but in the simple organizational system librarians had used for centuries. Her name was Margaret Ashford, and her colleagues thought she had lost her mind. They called her methods crazy, unconventional, and a waste of precious wartime resources. Some whispered that the stress of the war had broken her, that she was seeing patterns that did not exist, connections that were merely the product of an exhausted mind desperate to contribute something meaningful to the war effort. But Margaret knew something they didn't. She had discovered a pattern hidden in plain sight that would change the course of the war. The basement where she worked was cold and damp, the kind of penetrating chill that settled into your bones and never quite left. The walls were lined with metal shelving units that had been hastily installed to accommodate the overflow of materials that arrived daily from across occupied Europe. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across her workspace, making the index cards seem to multiply in the dim light. Margaret had been working for 16 hours straight, fueled by nothing but weak tea and the conviction that she was on the verge of something monumental. If you're enjoying this story of courage and ingenuity during one of history's darkest hours, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories to light. Margaret had always been meticulous, even as a child growing up in Oxford. She organized her books not just by author or title, but by themes, by emotional tone, by the weather described in their opening pages. Her father, a professor of medieval history at the university, had encouraged this peculiarity, seeing in his daughter's unusual mind something both extraordinary and potentially isolating. Her mother, more practical and concerned about Margaret's social development, worried that this obsessive need for order would make it difficult for her to connect with other children. And her mother had been right, to some extent. While other girls her age played games and formed tight friendship groups, Margaret spent her time in her father's study, reorganizing his extensive book collection according to systems she invented herself. She created elaborate catalogs on scraps of paper, cross-referencing books by subject, date of publication, geographical setting, and even the emotions they evoked in her when she read them. By the time she was 12, she had developed a classification system more complex than anything her father used in his academic work. Her teachers at the girls' grammar school she attended called it obsessive, occasionally writing concerned notes to her parents about Margaret's tendency to become so absorbed in organizing and categorizing that she would miss entire lessons. But her academic performance was exceptional, particularly in subjects that required pattern recognition and systematic thinking. Mathematics, languages, history, she excelled at them all, not through rote memorization, but through her ability to see connections and relationships that others missed. When Margaret joined the British Library in 1935 at the age of 24, her unusual mind found its perfect home among the endless rows of catalogued knowledge. The head librarian, a stern woman named Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, who had worked at the library for 30 years, recognized immediately that Margaret was different from the other young women who applied for positions. During the interview, Margaret had pointed out several inconsistencies in the library's cataloging system, not with arrogance, but with genuine curiosity about why certain organizational choices had been made. When war broke out in September 1939, Margaret was 28 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and deeply committed to her work. She had received proposals from 2 different men over the years, both respectable academics, who appreciated her intelligence even if they found her habits peculiar. She had declined both, unable to imagine a life that would require her to abandon the work that gave her such profound satisfaction. As men left for the front lines, Margaret watched the library empty of its male staff, its grand reading rooms gradually transforming from centers of scholarship into storage facilities for precious manuscripts evacuated from smaller institutions across Britain. The change happened slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, as the German advance across Europe made it clear that nowhere was truly safe from the reach of war. The smell of old paper and leather bindings that Margaret had always loved became mixed with new, harsher scents. The acrid odor of sandbags piled against windows, protection against the German bombs that fell with increasing frequency. The chemical smell of fire retardant that was sprayed on anything deemed irreplaceable. The mustiness of manuscripts that had been hastily packed and transported, sometimes damaged by rough handling or exposure to the elements during their journey to safety. Margaret adapted to these changes with the same methodical approach she brought to everything. She helped develop new systems for cataloging the incoming materials, creating detailed records not just of what each item was, but where it had come from, its condition upon arrival, and its relative importance in the collection. She worked longer hours as staff shortages became more severe, often staying in the library until well after dark, then making her way home through streets lit only by the pale light of a shielded moon. The bombing of London began in earnest in September 1940, and Margaret experienced her first real taste of fear. The library was hit twice during the Blitz, though neither time in the sections where the most valuable materials were stored. She was there for the second attack, working late in the basement cataloging room when the building shook with the force of a nearby explosion. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and for a terrible moment she thought the entire structure might collapse on top of her. But the library held, and after the all-clear sounded, Margaret simply brushed the dust from her clothes and returned to her work. By 1941, the library had become something else entirely. Intelligence officers began appearing with increasing frequency, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise their military bearing. They requested obscure German texts, technical manuals, pre-war academic journals, anything that might provide insight into enemy operations or help decode intercepted communications. Margaret assisted them all, pulling volumes from the stacks with her usual efficiency, noting their requests in her careful handwriting. She began to notice patterns in what they sought. References to specific German cities appeared repeatedly: Munich, Berlin, Hamburg, but also smaller towns that she had to look up on maps to locate. Particular dates kept recurring, not just obvious ones, like the invasion of Poland or the fall of France, but seemingly random dates that must have held some operational significance. Technical terminology related to communications equipment appeared in their requests, words that meant nothing to most people but clearly held importance for these serious men with their classified briefcases and guarded expressions. Margaret said nothing about these observations. She understood the need for secrecy in wartime, had signed all the necessary papers about not discussing anything she might overhear or deduce from the work that passed through her hands. But she could not help cataloging it all in her mind, creating mental index cards that cross-referenced each officer's requests, building an invisible map of intelligence interests that grew more complex with each passing week. One cold evening in January 1942, Margaret was working late, as had become her habit. The library closed to the public at 6, but staff with special clearance could remain, and Margaret often stayed until well past midnight. On this particular night, she was organizing a new shipment of intercepted German documents that had been delivered for translation and analysis. These were not classified materials, just everyday papers seized from occupied territories during military operations. Personal letters, newspaper clippings, business correspondence, administrative records, the kind of mundane paperwork that filled filing cabinets in every office across Europe. Most intelligence officers ignored such material, dismissing it as irrelevant noise compared to the important work of decoding military communications and analyzing strategic documents. But Margaret, with her librarian's instinct for seeing value in what others overlooked, found herself fascinated by these ordinary papers. They were windows into daily life under occupation, glimpses of how ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances. But Margaret saw something different. As she created catalog cards for these documents, using her own detailed classification system, she noticed recurring phrases, specific word combinations, that appeared with unusual frequency. They seemed innocuous, references to library books, mentions of catalog numbers, requests for specific volumes. But the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. She spent 3 nights mapping these references, creating a cross-referenced index card system that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. Each card represented not just a document, but a connection between documents, a relationship between phrases, dates, and locations. She used different colored cards, blue for references to books, yellow for dates, green for locations, red for names. She connected them with strings pinned to a large corkboard she had salvaged from a damaged reading room, creating a web that grew more complex by the hour. The breakthrough came on a freezing February morning, after 3 sleepless nights of obsessive work. Margaret had not gone home at all during that time, surviving on weak tea, stale biscuits from the staff room, and the fierce determination that she was onto something real, something that could not wait for normal working hours or proper rest. She stood before her corkboard in the dim basement, eyes burning from exhaustion, her hands trembling slightly from caffeine and fatigue. The board had grown enormous, covering nearly an entire wall. Hundreds of colored cards were pinned to it, connected by a spider's web of colored strings that would have looked like the ravings of a madwoman to anyone who did not understand her system. Blue strings connected book references, yellow marked temporal connections, green showed geographical relationships, red indicated potential agent identities. And suddenly, standing there in the gray light of dawn filtering through the high basement windows, she saw it. The pattern that had been hiding just beneath the surface of chaos resolved itself into perfect clarity. The references to catalog numbers were not random academic discussions or coincidental mentions of library materials. They were deliberate, systematic, and they followed a logic that was brilliant in its simplicity. The numbers corresponded to actual books in German libraries. She had verified that much already by cross-referencing against German library catalogs that the British Library had collected before the war. But it was not the books themselves that mattered. It was the catalog numbers assigned to them. When she applied the Dewey Decimal System, which many European libraries had adopted in the decades before the war, the numbers could be decoded in multiple ways. The main classification number could indicate a location using coordinates hidden within the decimal structure. The sub-classification numbers could represent dates and times. Even the cutter numbers, those additional digits used to further organize books within a category, could be interpreted as coded information. She grabbed a pencil with shaking hands and began working through one of the message chains she had identified. A letter from Brussels, dated 3 weeks earlier, mentioned needing to reference the volume catalogued as 940.532 in the Municipal Library Collection. At first glance, this seemed like an innocuous academic reference, someone looking for a specific history book. But Margaret knew that 940 was the Dewey classification for European history, and the subsequent numbers narrowed it down to World War I history. Why would anyone need such a specific reference in casual correspondence? She broke down the number differently, treating it not as a subject classification, but as encoded data. The first 3 digits after the decimal could represent a date, March 5th. The last 2 digits could be a time, 1200 hours, military time for noon. She cross-referenced this against known intelligence about German activities in Brussels. On March 5th at noon, a resistance cell had been raided by the Gestapo. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. She was looking at a communication system hidden in plain sight. Nazi agents, perhaps operating in occupied territories or even in neutral countries, were passing messages by referencing library catalog numbers in seemingly innocent correspondence. To anyone unfamiliar with library classification systems, it looked like academic discussion. But to someone like Margaret, someone who understood the architecture of information itself, it was a code as clear as day. Her hands shaking with excitement and fear, Margaret drafted a report. She knew it would sound absurd. A librarian claiming to have discovered a Nazi communication system based on the Dewey Decimal System. They would dismiss her, perhaps even remove her from any involvement with sensitive materials, but she had to try. The next morning, running on nervous energy alone, Margaret requested a meeting with Commander James Hartley, the intelligence officer who regularly visited the library. He was a stern man in his 50s, a career military officer who had served in the Great War and wore his experience like armor. He had little patience for what he considered civilian interference in military matters, and had made it clear on several occasions that, while he appreciated the library staff's assistance, intelligence work should be left to intelligence professionals. He agreed to see her only because she'd always been helpful in locating research materials, never wasting his time with unnecessary questions or attempts at conversation beyond what was required. He arrived at 10 o'clock precisely, as scheduled, his uniform immaculate, despite the general shabbiness that had crept into everyone's appearance as the war dragged on and resources became scarce. Margaret led him to a private reading room she had reserved, one of the smaller chambers that had once been used for examining rare manuscripts. She had spent the early morning hours preparing her presentation, organizing her cards and charts in a way that she hoped would make sense to someone who did not live inside her head, who could not see the connections as clearly as she could. She spread her materials across the large oak table that dominated the room. Hartley stood with his arms crossed, his expression skeptical but not entirely dismissive. He was, at least, giving her the courtesy of his attention. Margaret took a deep breath and began to explain her theory, forcing herself to speak slowly and clearly despite the exhaustion that made her thoughts feel fuzzy at the edges. She showed him the patterns she had identified, laying out the intercepted documents in chronological order, pointing out the recurring references to catalog numbers. She explained the Dewey Decimal System to him, how it worked, how it was used in libraries across Europe, including many in Germany and occupied territories. She walked him through her decoding method, showing how the numbers could be interpreted as coordinates, dates, times, and even operational codes. Hartley listened without interrupting, which Margaret took as either a good sign or evidence that he was simply being polite before dismissing her. She spoke quickly, desperately, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to convey in minutes what had taken her weeks to understand. She showed him the correlation between decoded messages and known German military activities, the precision of the timing, the accuracy of the locations. When she finished, silence filled the room. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had laid out everything, exposed her theory to scrutiny, and now waited for judgment. Finally, Hartley leaned forward, his skeptical expression shifting to something else, something sharper and more focused. He began asking questions, and they were not the dismissive questions of someone looking for reasons to reject her theory. They were the sharp, precise questions of an intelligence officer testing a hypothesis, probing for weaknesses, searching for the flaws that would indicate wishful thinking rather than genuine discovery. Margaret answered each question, her confidence growing as she realized he was not dismissing her outright, but genuinely considering her findings. He asked how widespread the system might be, whether she had found evidence of it beyond the Brussels documents, what resources she would need to test the theory more thoroughly. He asked technical questions about library cataloging systems, questions she could answer easily, drawing on years of professional knowledge. An hour passed, then another. Hartley pulled up a chair and sat down, studying her charts more carefully, asking her to walk him through specific examples again. He made notes in a small leather notebook, his handwriting as precise as his questions. At one point, he asked permission to take some of her materials, promising they would be returned within the week. Margaret hesitated. These were her only copies, but she understood that he needed to show them to his superiors to verify her claims against intelligence sources she would never be allowed to see. Finally, Hartley straightened. He told her he would need to verify her claims, that he would take her materials to his superiors. He warned her not to discuss this with anyone, emphasizing the sensitive nature of intelligence work. Then, to her surprise, he asked if she would be willing to work with his team if her theory proved correct. 2 weeks passed with no word. Margaret continued her regular duties, but her mind was constantly on those catalog cards, wondering if she had been wrong, if she had wasted the commander's time with an elaborate fantasy born of too many hours spent in dusty archives. Then, on a gray March morning, Hartley returned. With him were 2 other men, both in civilian clothes, but with the bearing of military officers. They had tested her theory against known intelligence, and it worked. Not every reference was a coded message, but enough were to confirm that she had indeed discovered an active German communication network. What happened next changed Margaret's life completely. She was brought into the intelligence operation under such strict secrecy that even her immediate supervisor at the library was told only that she had been assigned to special war work and would not be available for regular duties. She was sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act, in a brief formal ceremony that made the enormity of what she had discovered feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. She was given a small team of assistants, carefully selected from various branches of military intelligence and civilian services. There was Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, a young woman from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force who had a gift for languages and could read German as fluently as English. Private Robert Chen, whose parents had emigrated from China before the war, and who brought a unique perspective on code systems, having grown up bilingual and able to see patterns across different linguistic structures. And Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, a former schoolteacher in her 50s who had lost her son at Dunkirk and approached the work with a quiet, determined fury that Margaret understood completely. Margaret's unusual card catalog system became the foundation for their decoding operation. While the famous codebreakers at Bletchley Park worked on German military ciphers using complex mathematics, and the revolutionary computing machines being developed there, Margaret and her team focused on this hidden communication channel that operated through library references and academic correspondence. The work was exhausting in ways Margaret had never experienced. Every intercepted letter, every captured document had to be analyzed for potential catalog references. They developed a system for quickly identifying likely candidates, certain phrases that appeared with suspicious frequency, particular formatting choices that might indicate encoded information. But even with these shortcuts, the volume of material was overwhelming. Margaret trained her assistants to think like librarians, to understand the logic of classification systems, to see patterns where others saw only mundane text. She taught them about the different cataloging systems used across Europe, not just Dewey Decimal, but also older national systems that some German libraries still used. She showed them how to cross-reference materials, how to build networks of information that might reveal agent identities or operational patterns. They worked in a converted storage room in the library's basement, a space that had once housed old periodicals but had been hastily fitted with desks, filing cabinets, and the corkboards that Margaret insisted were essential to her method. The room was always cold, always damp, and the single radiator they had been provided did little more than take the worst edge off the chill. They could hear the rumble of the underground trains passing beneath them, a constant reminder of the city continuing its life above, while they worked in this hidden space. The intelligence they uncovered was more valuable than anyone had initially expected. They identified Nazi agents operating in neutral Sweden, where the Germans were using the extensive library system to coordinate intelligence gathering about Allied shipping. They discovered planned sabotage operations in North Africa by decoding messages hidden in scholarly correspondence about archaeological texts. They even helped track the movement of high-ranking German officers who used this communication system, believing it was unbreakable in its simplicity. The beauty of Margaret's discovery was precisely that simplicity. The Germans had assumed that hiding in plain sight, using the mundane language of library science, would make their communications invisible. Academic and scholarly correspondence was generally given low priority by intelligence services, considered too boring, too specialized to be worth the time and resources required to analyze it thoroughly. They had not counted on someone who understood that language better than they did, someone for whom the arcane details of cataloging systems were as natural as breathing. But the work took its toll. Margaret rarely left the library, sleeping in a small room they had set up for night shifts. She lost weight, her health declining under the stress and long hours. Her colleagues, those who did not know the nature of her work, worried about her, urging her to rest, to take time away from the archives. She could not tell them why that was impossible, could not explain that every hour she spent away might mean another coded message went undetected, another operation went unreported. In June 1943, Margaret's work contributed to one of the war's most significant intelligence victories, though her role would remain classified for decades. Her team had been tracking a particular series of messages that appeared in correspondence flowing through neutral Turkey, a crucial crossroads where information from both Allied and Axis powers passed through diplomatic channels. The messages were more sophisticated than most they had encountered, using not just library catalog numbers, but also cross-references to multiple cataloging systems, creating layers of encoding that required extensive analysis to unravel. Margaret spent weeks on this particular network, barely sleeping, eating only when Sarah Morrison or Dorothy Hughes forced food in front of her. The breakthrough came when she realized the messages were using a hybrid system, combining Dewey Decimal classifications with an older German cataloging system that had fallen out of use in most libraries, but was still maintained in certain specialized collections. The person creating these messages had deep knowledge of library science, possibly was or had been a professional librarian themselves. This made them more dangerous, but also, paradoxically, easier for Margaret to understand once she recognized the pattern. The decoded messages revealed an entire network of German intelligence operatives in Turkey, their identities, their contacts, their methods of gathering information about Allied supply convoys passing through the Mediterranean. The information was so valuable that it was immediately passed to the highest levels of British intelligence and shared with American allies. Within 2 months, the network had been neutralized. Some agents were arrested by Turkish authorities, quietly and without public acknowledgement. Others simply disappeared, presumably recalled to Germany once the Axis powers realized their communications had been compromised. The Mediterranean supply routes became significantly safer, and thousands of tons of supplies that might have been lost to German U-boats or air attacks reached their destinations intact. Commander Hartley, who had become something of a mentor to Margaret over the months of working together, visited her in the basement to deliver the news personally. He told her that her contribution had potentially saved thousands of lives, that military planners estimated the secure supply routes would shorten the war by months, but he also saw what the work was costing her. Her hands trembled constantly now, her eyes were deeply shadowed, and she had developed a persistent cough from the damp basement conditions. In September 1943, Margaret collapsed at her work table. She had been in the middle of analyzing a new batch of documents when the world simply went dark. When she woke, she was in a military hospital, weak and disoriented, with no clear memory of how she had gotten there. Dorothy Hughes had found her, they told her later, slumped over her cards with a fever so high she was delirious. The doctors diagnosed severe exhaustion in the early stages of pneumonia, complications from months of working in the cold, damp basement without adequate rest or nutrition. Her immune system, weakened by stress and lack of sleep, had simply given up the fight against the infection that had been building in her lungs for weeks. As she lay recovering, too weak even to sit up without assistance, Margaret felt a frustration that bordered on rage. There was so much work to do, so many documents waiting for analysis, patterns that only she could see. She tried to explain this to the nurses who cared for her, but they just smiled kindly and told her to rest, treating her concerns as fever-induced delirium rather than legitimate operational urgency. It was Hartley who finally made her understand. He visited her a week into her hospital stay, when she was strong enough to hold a coherent conversation, but still too weak to leave her bed. He brought news that her methods were being taught to intelligence officers across the Allied forces, that her card catalog system was being adapted for other code-breaking operations. Teams in Washington, in Cairo, in New Delhi were learning to see patterns the way she did. He also brought an order, delivered with the kind firmness of a commanding officer who would not tolerate argument. When she recovered, she would train a replacement to handle the day-to-day decoding work. She would take a new role, supervising the program rather than working directly on analysis. Margaret protested, her voice still weak and raspy from the pneumonia, arguing that no one understood the system as well as she did, that she was needed in the basement with her team. Hartley listened patiently, then leaned forward and spoke with unusual gentleness. He told her that she had created something remarkable, something that would outlive her direct involvement in it, but she would be no good to anyone, no good to the war effort, if she worked herself to death. He had seen too many brilliant people burn themselves out, he said, had watched talented officers and analysts push until they broke. He would not let that happen to her. The recovery was slow. Margaret spent weeks in the hospital, then more weeks convalescing at her family home in Oxford. For the first time in years, she slept through the night, ate proper meals, walked in gardens that were not surrounded by sandbags. She read books for pleasure rather than searching them for patterns and codes. Slowly, her health returned. When she came back to London in early 1944, her role had changed as promised. She supervised a team that had grown to over 20 people, training new recruits in her methods, overseeing the expansion of the catalog-based decoding operation. She was no longer in the basement every night, but her influence was felt across the entire program. The work continued through the invasion of Normandy, through the liberation of France, through the final desperate months of the war. Margaret's team decoded hundreds of messages, each one adding another piece to the vast puzzle of Allied intelligence operations. They worked in obscurity, their contributions known only to a small circle of military and intelligence officials. When the war ended in May 1945, Margaret was 34 years old. She had given 6 years to the war effort, sacrificed her health, her youth, and any semblance of a normal life. The intelligence operation she had helped create was dismantled, its methods absorbed into other agencies, its records classified and locked away. She returned to the British Library to the work of cataloging and organizing that had always been her passion. Her colleagues welcomed her back, never knowing that the quiet, thin woman who resumed her duties had played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany. The work she had done remained classified, covered by the Official Secrets Act that bound everyone involved in wartime intelligence operations. For decades, Margaret lived a quiet life. She never married, dedicating herself instead to her work at the library. She advanced through the ranks, eventually becoming head of the acquisitions department, respected for her meticulous attention to detail and her innovative approaches to cataloging. Those who worked with her noticed her peculiar habits, the way she could see patterns where others saw chaos, the complex systems she created for organizing information. They assumed it was just the eccentric brilliance of a dedicated librarian. In 1974, at the age of 63, Margaret retired. A small ceremony was held in her honor, attended by colleagues and library officials. They praised her decades of service, her contributions to library science, her mentorship of younger librarians. What they did not mention, what they could not know, was that her greatest contribution had been made in a basement during wartime, creating order from chaos in a way that had helped win a war. It was not until the 1990s, when many wartime intelligence operations were finally declassified, that Margaret's work became public knowledge. By then, she was in her 80s, living in a small flat near Oxford, her health failing. When journalists contacted her, seeking interviews about her role in wartime codebreaking, she was reluctant to speak. She had kept the secret so long that breaking it felt wrong, even with official permission. But eventually, she agreed to tell her story. She spoke about the card catalog system, about the patterns she had seen, about the months and years spent in that basement decoding Nazi messages hidden in library references. She emphasized the contributions of her team, the assistants and analysts who had worked alongside her, many of whose names had never been recorded in official histories. She also spoke about the cost, the friendships she had never formed, the life she had never lived outside those basement walls, the health problems that had plagued her for decades as a result of those years of stress and exhaustion. She did not regret her service, she was clear about that, but she wanted people to understand that victory had been built on countless individual sacrifices, many of them made by people whose names would never be remembered. Margaret Ashford died in 1997 at the age of 86. Her obituary mentioned her long career at the British Library and, in its final paragraphs, her wartime service in intelligence operations. A fuller account of her work was published several years later when more documents were declassified, revealing the extent of the Nazi communication network she had helped dismantle. Today, intelligence historians recognize Margaret's contribution as one of the war's most innovative code-breaking achievements. While the work at Bletchley Park focused on complex mechanical and mathematical approaches to cryptography, Margaret had proven that sometimes the simplest systems, understood deeply enough, could be just as effective. Her insight that the Germans would hide their communications in the language of library science, and her ability to decode that language, had given the Allies a crucial advantage. The card catalog system she developed influenced intelligence methods for decades, teaching analysts to look for patterns in seemingly mundane documents. to understand that codes could be hidden not in mathematical complexity, but in cultural knowledge, in the specialized languages of professions and academic disciplines. Her legacy lived on in the training programs of intelligence agencies, in the approaches analysts used to decode enemy communications. But perhaps the most important legacy was simpler. Margaret had shown that brilliance could come from unexpected places, that the skills and knowledge gained in peaceful professions could be transformed into weapons against tyranny. She had been a librarian, a person trained to organize and preserve knowledge, and she had used those skills to help defeat one of history's greatest evils. In the basement of the British Library, there is now a small plaque commemorating her work. It is not in a public area, few people ever see it, but it marks the spot where Margaret Ashford sat surrounded by index cards and colored strings, seeing patterns no one else could see, creating order from chaos, and in doing so, helping to change the course of history. Her story reminds us that in times of crisis, heroism takes many forms. It is not always found on battlefields or in dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it is found in quiet rooms, in patient work, in the determination to use whatever skills we have in service of something greater than ourselves. Margaret never fired a weapon, never flew a plane, never stormed a beach. But she fought just as surely, using the tools she knew best, the organizational systems and pattern recognition skills that had seemed merely eccentric in peacetime, but proved invaluable in war. The war had called on everyone to contribute what they could. For Margaret Ashford, that meant taking the peculiar, obsessive way she saw information, the card catalog system that others had called crazy, and transforming it into a weapon against those who would have destroyed everything she valued. In doing so, she proved that sometimes the most unlikely people, using the most unexpected methods, can make the greatest difference. Her cards are gone now, destroyed as classified material after the war. Her charts and strings, the physical manifestation of her brilliant mind, exist only in photographs taken for intelligence archives. But the impact of her work, the lives saved and battles won because of the messages she decoded, that remains. It is woven into the fabric of history, largely invisible but absolutely essential, much like Margaret herself. She had been right all along. The answer had been in the cards, in the careful organization and cross-referencing that was second nature to a librarian, but invisible to those who did not understand the language of catalogs and classification. She had seen what others missed, not because she was smarter, but because she was different, because her mind worked in ways that the world had called crazy until the moment that crazy thinking was exactly what was needed. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest lesson of Margaret Ashford's story, that the qualities that make us different, the obsessions and peculiarities that set us apart, those are not weaknesses to be hidden or corrected. They are potential strengths waiting for the right moment, the right challenge, to reveal their true value. Margaret had been peculiar, obsessive, unconventional, and those qualities, channeled in the service of a righteous cause, had helped win a war.